The phone rang just as I was about to turn off the lights for the night. It wasn't unusual. My life has always been a revolving door of family drama, but something in the way it cut through the silence felt different. When I saw Jake's name flash across the screen, my stomach tightened. He never called this late unless something was wrong. Claire. His voice trembled on the other end, fragile and small, like he was holding back tears. I don't know what to do. My heart sank. Jake, what's going wrong? There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. Can we meet, please? Just not here. Somewhere quiet. I hesitated only for a moment before agreeing. An hour later, I found myself sitting at a corner table in a dimly lit cafe near his campus, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee while waiting for him. The place smelled faintly of burnt espresso and stale pastries, but it was empty enough that no one would overhear us. When Jake walked in, his shoulders were hunched, his hoodie pulled up like armor against the world. My chest ached seeing him like this. The kid who used to chase me around the backyard with water balloons now looked so lost. What's going on? I asked gently after he slid into the seat across from me. He stared down at his hands, twisting them nervously. Everything feels too much lately, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Like I'm drowning, and there's no way out without disappointing everyone. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just teenage angst. This was deeper, darker, and little did I know, answering that call would unravel everything I thought I knew, not just about Jake, but about love, family, and even myself. Let's figure this out together, I said, finally reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. But as our eyes met, I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment marked the beginning of something neither of us could have anticipated. The cafe was quiet, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Jake sat across from me, his hands wrapped tightly around a mug of hot chocolate. He looked so young in that moment, yet there was a weight in his eyes that no 19-year-old should have to carry. I don't know who I'm supposed to be, he admitted after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper. Everyone has these expectations, my parents, my friends, even myself, but none of it feels real, like I'm just going through the motions. I nodded, leaning forward slightly. It's okay to feel lost, Jake. Life doesn't come with a manual. Trust me, I've spent most of mine trying to figure out what fitting in even means. My words felt clumsy, but they were honest. I wanted him to know he wasn't alone. His gaze flickered up at me, searching for something, validation, maybe, or understanding. Do you ever feel like you're letting people down? Like no matter what you do, it's never enough? The question hit too close to home. I thought about all the times I'd felt like the black sheep in our family, always compared to my siblings, always falling short. More often than I'd like to admit, I said softly, but here's the thing, you can't live your life for other people. You'll lose yourself if you try. Jake didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared into his mug as if the answers might float to the surface. When he finally spoke again, his voice cracked with emotion. What if I don't even know who I am yet? What if I mess everything up before I figure it out? My heart ached for him. Reaching across the table, I placed a hand over his. You're not going to mess everything up. You're brave, Jake. Braver than you realize. And figuring out who you are takes time. It's not something anyone gets right on the first try. He gave me a small, almost shy smile, then one that made him look younger somehow. Thanks, Aunt Claire. You're different, you know? You actually listen. That comment stayed with me long after we left the cafe. Over the next few weeks, we started texting regularly. At first, it was casual, checking in, sharing funny memes, but soon our conversations deepened. Jake confided in me about his fears of coming out, about feeling suffocated by his parents' rigid expectations. In turn, I shared pieces of my own struggles, the loneliness of being an artist in a world that values stability, the pressure of living up to impossible standards. Each message brought us closer, blurring the lines between aunt and nephew, mentor and confidant. There was an ease to our connection, a sense of being truly seen without judgment. It was intoxicating and terrifying because somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't just helping him navigate his chaos. I was finding solace in his presence, too. The evening had been heavy with words, too many of them spilling out in raw, unfiltered streams. Jake sat on my couch, his hands gripping the edge of a throw pillow like it was some kind of lifeline. His voice cracked as he talked about feeling invisible, misunderstood, suffocated by expectations that didn't fit him. I feel so alone, he whispered, tears slipping down his cheeks. My heart clenched at the sight of him breaking apart right in front of me. Without thinking, I reached for him, pulling him into a tight hug. He stiffened for half a second before collapsing into it, his face pressed against my shoulder as his breath hitched. It was meant to comfort, to remind him he wasn't as alone as he thought, but something shifted in that moment. The air between us seemed to hum with an energy neither of us acknowledged, but both felt. When I started to pull back, Jake turned toward me, his eyes wide and glistening. Before I could process what was happening, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine softly. Time stopped. My body froze, caught somewhere between instinct and disbelief. For a fleeting second, I didn't move. I couldn't. Then reality slammed back in, and we both jerked away simultaneously, shock written all over our faces. "I'm sorry," Jake stammered, his voice trembling. I shouldn't have." He looked away, his cheeks flaming red, panic etched across his features. No, it's okay," I said quickly, though my own voice betrayed how rattled I was. My mind raced, guilt and confusion swirling together like storm clouds. What had just happened? This was Jake, my nephew, barely 19 years old. And yet there it was lingering between us, a spark, undeniable and electric, wrapped up in layers of wrongness. We sat there in silence, the weight of what we'd done pressing down on us. Neither of us spoke, but the tension remained, a quiet hum that neither of us could ignore. The nights that followed were endless, each one stretching longer than the last. Sleep eluded me as if it had given up on me altogether. My mind raced with thoughts I couldn't silence. Images of Jake's face, his voice trembling as he confessed feelings I wasn't ready to hear, let alone reciprocate. And yet, there they were, lodged in my chest like a splinter I couldn't pull out. How could this happen? He was my nephew, barely 19 years old, a kid who still needed guidance, support, not someone to complicate his life further with something so wrong. Every rational part of me screamed at the top of its lungs. This is a line you cannot cross. But then there was the other part, the quiet, insidious voice whispering that maybe lines weren't meant to be permanent, that maybe what we felt wasn't just reckless desire, but something deeper, something neither of us could ignore. I kept replaying the moment when our lips met, the softness of his kiss, the way my body responded before my brain could intervene. It wasn't supposed to feel right. It couldn't feel right. Yet, for those fleeting seconds, I'd felt more alive than I had in years. Seen, wanted, understood in ways no one else had ever managed. Not even myself. But the guilt, it clawed at me relentlessly. What kind of person does this make me? How could I betray my sister, her trust, her family? She'd raised Jake to be better than this, to have boundaries and values. And here I was dismantling all of that with a single reckless act. The weight of it pressed down on my chest until breathing felt like an effort. Jake, too, was struggling. I could see it in the way he avoided eye contact during family gatherings, how he hesitated before texting me now, as though second-guessing every word. When we finally spoke again, his voice cracked under the strain of unspoken emotions. "I can't stop thinking about it," he admitted one evening over the phone. "About us, Jake. I started, my tone firmer than I intended. We can't keep doing this. You know that. I know, he said quickly, almost defensively. But why does it feel so real? Like, why does being around you make everything else seem less important? His words hit me like a punch to the gut because they mirrored exactly what I'd been trying to suppress. I wanted to tell him he was confused, that he didn't know what love was yet, that this was just some misguided infatuation born out of loneliness. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Not entirely. There was a connection between us, a spark that refused to dim, no matter how hard I tried to snuff it out. For Jake, it seemed even harder. He wrestled with guilt not just toward me, but toward his parents, toward the expectations placed on him since birth. They've done so much for me, he said once, his voice thick with emotion. And here I am, throwing it all away because I can't stop feeling whatever this is. You're not throwing anything away, I said gently, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. You're figuring things out. We both are. But what if figuring it out means losing everything? He asked, his voice breaking. What if loving someone isn't supposed to hurt this much? Loving someone. The phrase hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded. Was that what this was? Love? Or was it something darker? Messier, a collision of need and circumstance that neither of us could untangle? As the days turned into weeks, the tension grew unbearable. I told myself we could fix this, that we could go back to the way things were before. But the truth was, I didn't want to. Not really. Being near Jake made me feel things I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Hope, passion, longing. Dangerous things. Forbidden things. And yet, the cost of giving in loomed large. Our family would shatter if they found out. Lives would unravel. Trust would crumble. Could any amount of love, or whatever this was, be worth that kind of destruction? The rain tapped against the windows like a metronome, steady and unrelenting. It was one of those nights where the world outside felt distant, muffled by the storm, leaving only the two of us in its quiet cocoon. Jake had shown up at my apartment unexpectedly, drenched from the downpour, his hoodie clinging to him like a second skin. I just needed to see you, he'd said, his voice trembling as he stood in my doorway. I didn't ask questions. I couldn't. Something about the desperation in his eyes told me this wasn't a visit I could turn away. We sat on the couch for hours, talking about everything and nothing. Dreams we buried under layers of expectation. Fears that kept us awake at night. The kind of conversations that strip you bare, leaving your soul exposed. Jake spoke with an honesty that made my chest ache, the kind of vulnerability that comes when someone trusts you completely, even if it scares them. And I listened, really listened, because how could I not? He was unraveling himself in front of me, piece by fragile piece, and all I wanted to do was hold him together. But holding him together meant getting closer than either of us should have allowed. At some point, the words stopped coming, replaced by a silence so heavy it pressed against my ribs. We were sitting too close now, our knees brushing, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. His hand found mine, tentative at first, then firmer, as though testing whether I'd pull away. I didn't. How could I, when every fiber of my being screamed to stay? It happened slowly, achingly so. One moment, we were staring at each other, lost in the depths of what we both knew we shouldn't feel. The next, his lips were on mine, soft but insistent, and I let myself fall into it. All the guilt, the fear, the rational thoughts, they dissolved in an instant, swept away by the tide of emotion crashing over us. It wasn't just passion, it was tenderness, a collision of longing and vulnerability that left me breathless. Every touch sent a jolt through me, electric and raw, as though our bodies already knew what our minds refused to accept. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the couch, the sound of the rain still drumming against the glass. My heart pounded in my chest. loud enough that I thought it might wake the entire building. Jake's head rested on my shoulder, his breathing slow but uneven, like he was trying to steady himself. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the weight of what we'd done settling over us like a thick fog. "We'll figure this out," I whispered finally, my voice barely audible over the rain. But the words felt hollow, even to me. What do they mean anyway? Figure what out? How to justify the unjustifiable? How to navigate a relationship that defied every rule, every boundary we'd ever known? I didn't know. Not really. All I knew was that I couldn't bring myself to let go of him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Jake nodded silently, his fingers tightening around mine. He didn't say anything, but I could feel the tension in his body, the way he clung to me like I was the only thing keeping him grounded. Maybe I was. Or maybe we were both adrift, clinging to each other in the hope that somehow together we could find solid ground. As the minutes stretched into hours, neither of us moved. The rain continued to fall, washing away the remnants of the lives we'd lived before tonight. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. We'd crossed a line, and it was one we couldn't uncross. The cracks began to show in small, almost imperceptible ways at first. Jake grew quieter around his parents, retreating into himself like a turtle pulling back into its shell. Family dinners that used to feel warm, if not slightly chaotic, now felt suffocating. He avoided eye contact with me whenever we were in the same room, though I could feel his gaze on me when he thought I wasn't looking. It was maddening, this dance of pretending nothing had changed while everything between us simmered just beneath the surface. And then there were my sister's glances, sharp, probing, like she was trying to piece together a puzzle she didn't quite understand yet. "You've been spending a lot of time with Jake lately," she remarked one afternoon as we cleaned up after lunch. Her tone was casual, but the weight behind her words made my stomach churn. "He's going through some stuff," I said quickly, maybe too quickly, "just trying to be there for him." She nodded slowly, her lips pursed in a way that told me she wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, don't let him take advantage of you, Claire. You're always so willing to help everyone else, but sometimes," she trailed off, shaking her head. "Anyway, I hope he appreciates it." Her words lingered long after she left the kitchen. Was she onto something? Or was I overthinking every glance, every comment? Either way, the guilt gnawed at me constantly, a relentless ache in my chest. The turning point came unexpectedly, a careless mistake that neither of us saw coming. Jake had borrowed my scarf one rainy evening, and somehow it ended up tangled in the sheets of his bed. His mother found it the next morning. "What is this?" she demanded, holding it up like evidence in a courtroom. Jake froze, his face pale. It's mine," he stammered, reaching for it, but she pulled it away before he could grab it. "Don't lie to me, Jacob," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This isn't yours. Whose is it? Who are you seeing?" "I'm not seeing anyone," he shot back, panic rising in his voice. "It's just someone lent it to me, okay? It doesn't mean anything." But the accusation hung heavy in the air, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She stared at him, her eyes narrowing. "Someone older, isn't it? Someone who shouldn't be anywhere near you." Jake didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. That night, he texted me frantically. "She knows something's up. What do we do?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. What could we do? The walls were closing in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all spiraling out of control. For Jake's sake, for both our sakes, I knew what I had to do. The next day, I called him. "We need to stop," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound firm. "This is getting too dangerous, Jake. Your mom suspects something. If she finds out, you think I don't know that?" He interrupted, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Do you think I don't lie awake at night wondering when this whole thing will blow up in our faces? But you don't get to just "Shut me out, Claire. Not like this." "It's not about shutting you out," I insisted, though even I didn't believe the words. "It's about protecting you. You deserve better than this, better than me." "No," he said fiercely, his voice breaking. "You don't get to decide what's best for me. I'm not some kid you can push away anymore. I'm not stupid, Claire. I know what I want. And what if what you want destroys everything?" I shot back, tears streaming down my face now. "What if it ruins your relationship with your parents? With your family? Is that really worth it?" He was silent for a moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but unyielding. "Maybe it is." That night, he showed up at my apartment unannounced, soaked from the rain and visibly shaking with anger or maybe fear. I opened the door, and before I could say a word, he stepped inside, slamming it shut behind him. "You don't get to make decisions for me," he said, his voice low and raw. "Not anymore. You can't just walk away and act like you're doing me some big favor, like you're saving me, because you're not. You're running away. I'm trying to protect you." I shouted, the frustration spilling out of me. "Can't you see that? This isn't normal, Jake. We're not supposed to be doing this." "And who gets to decide what's normal?" he countered, stepping closer until there was barely any space between us. "Is it them? My parents? Society? Because none of that matters to me right now. All I care about is how I feel when I'm with you. And you're telling me that's wrong." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was young and confused and didn't know what he was saying. But deep down, I knew he was right. This wasn't just about him, it was about me, too. About the part of me that couldn't let go, no matter how hard I tried. The days that followed our heated confrontation were a blur of silence and distance. Jake threw himself into his schoolwork, spending late nights at the library and avoiding family gatherings like the plague. I, on the other hand, started seeing a therapist, a decision born out of guilt and desperation to untangle the mess we'd made. Sitting in that small, dimly lit office every week, I found myself spilling truths I hadn't even admitted to myself. "It's wrong," I said during one session, my voice cracking. But it felt real, like nothing else ever has. My therapist listened patiently, her expression neutral but kind. She didn't judge. She just guided me toward understanding why I'd let things spiral so far. Meanwhile, Jake seemed determined to carve out a life for himself, one where he wasn't defined by anyone else's expectations. He stopped texting me as often, and when he did, the messages were short, almost formal. It stung more than I cared to admit, but I told myself it was for the best. We needed this space to grow, to heal, to figure out who we were outside of each other. Months passed before we saw each other again. It was at a family barbecue, the kind of event neither of us could easily skip without raising suspicion. The backyard buzzed with laughter and chatter, the smell of grilled burgers filling the air. When Jake walked in, my breath caught in my throat. He looked different, older, somehow, more confident. Our eyes met briefly across the yard, and for a moment, the world around us faded. Then he smiled, a polite, distant smile, and nodded. "Hey, Aunt Claire," he said when he finally approached me, his tone casual but tinged with something unspoken. "Hey, Jake," I replied, forcing a smile of my own. "How's school?" "It's good," he said quickly, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Busy, trying to stay focused." "That's great," I said, though the words felt hollow. There was so much left unsaid between us, hanging heavy in the air like storm clouds waiting to break. We exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes before he excused himself, disappearing into the crowd. As I watched him go, an ache settled deep in my chest, an ache that reminded me of everything we'd lost. Neither of us knew if our connection would ever resurface, or if it even should. But one thing was certain, what we'd shared had changed us both irrevocably. It was a chapter etched into the fabric of our lives, one we'd carry with us forever, even if only in fragments of memory. The questions haunted me, circling in my mind like restless birds. Was what we felt wrong simply because the world said it was? Love, or whatever this was between Jake and me, didn't fit neatly into any box society had created. It wasn't supposed to exist, not like this, but it did. And denying its existence didn't make it disappear. It only made the weight of it heavier. Could familial bonds shift, evolve, become something more without unraveling everything? I wanted to believe they could, that love, no matter how unconventional, didn't have to destroy. Yet every time I looked at Jake, I saw the fragility of that hope. He was young, still finding himself, and I couldn't shake the fear that I was shaping him in ways he'd later regret. Guilt became a constant companion, whispering cruel truths. You're selfish. You're ruining him. But desire fought back just as fiercely, reminding me how alive I felt with him, how seen, how wanted. Reconciling those desires with the expectations of family, of morality, felt impossible, like standing on the edge of a cliff, torn between jumping and stepping back. Maybe there were no clear answers. Maybe love wasn't meant to be measured by rules or norms, but by the way it made you feel whole, even if that wholeness came at a cost.